Joseph Mobutu, named Joseph Desire Mobutu at birth, was the second president of Zaire, now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, from 1965 to 1997. Mobutu was born in 1930 in the Belgian Congo and studied journalism. In 1958, Mobutu became the country's state secretary and then was named chief of staff of the Congolese army by Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba and President Joseph Kasavubu when the country gained independence from Belgium in 1960. A year later, Mobutu helped President Kasavubu oust Lumumba. Mobutu became the new prime minister. In 1965, Mobutu exiled Kasavubu in a military coup and announced himself president, forming a one-party state around his Mouvement Populaire de la Révolution, MPR. With support from the United States and other Western powers because of his staunch anti-communist stance, Mobutu became the unchallenged leader of the Congo, ruling the country for the next 32 years. In 1971, Mobutu changed the country's name to Zaire and forced all citizens to adopt more African-sounding names. He himself changed his name to Mobutu Sese Seko Kukumbitu Wazabunga. Mobutu argued that the name change of all of Zaire's citizens allowed the people to feel a sense of sovereignty and identification with African culture, especially after years of colonial rule. The act also helped legitimize Mobutu as an authoritarian dictator. As president, Mobutu lived luxuriously with numerous palaces and foreign cars while the vast majority of Zaire's population lived in poverty. As Mobutu amassed a personal fortune under his kleptocracy, the country's economy virtually collapsed. In 1990, under growing internal and international pressure, Mobutu ended his formal dictatorship. He allowed national political parties to re-emerge while still manipulating local and national elections to keep himself and his supporters in power. By 1994, Mobutu's presidency was under threat when Rwandan rebels infiltrated and terrorized Rwandan genocide refugees that had fled into the eastern provinces of Zaire. Rebel activity encouraged indigenous insurgents to challenge Mobutu's power. 2 years later, Mobutu was diagnosed with prostate cancer and neglected many of his political duties, spending most of his time overseas as he underwent treatment. In 1997, rebel insurgent Laurent Desire Kabila overthrew the Mobutu regime. Kabila renamed the country as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The banished Joseph Desire Mobutu died from prostate cancer on September 7, 1997, in Morocco. Mobutu Sese Seko was born Joseph Mobutu in Lisala, Belgian Congo. His father was a cook, who died when Mobutu was a child, and his mother was a maid in a hotel. She used her earnings to send him to a Christian Brothers Catholic boarding school for his education. In 1949 he joined the Force Publique, an internal security force of Congolese troops but with Belgian officers, and rose to sergeant. He stayed there for 7 years, leaving to become a newspaper reporter. It was in that position that he met Congolese nationalist Patrice Lumumba, and Mobutu was so taken with him that he joined Lumumba's political party, the Congolese National Movement, MNC. When the Congo became independent on June 30, 1960, a coalition government led the country, with Lumumba as prime minister and Joseph Kasavubu as president. Mobutu was appointed army chief of staff. Lumumba and Kasavubu then locked horns in a struggle for political supremacy, and on September 14, 1960, a military coup overthrew Lumumba and installed Kasavubu as overall leader. One of the key figures in the coup was none other than Lumumba's old friend, Mobutu. It turned out that both the American CIA and the Belgian government mistrusted Lumumba, who they thought to be a communist or at least pro-communist, and wanted Kasavubu in power, as they believed correctly, as it turned out that Kasavubu and Mobutu would be more pliable. 5 years later, though, Mobutu led a coup against Kasavubu, who had just managed to oust his rival, popular Prime Minister Moise Tshombe. Upon taking power, Mobutu banned all political parties and declared the equivalent of a state of emergency, taking on almost dictatorial powers. He later formed his own party, the Popular Movement of the Revolution, which all Congolese were obliged to join. He ordered all existing trade unions to form a single union, the National Union of Zairean Workers, and placed it under the control of the government. Although there were several uprisings and attempted coups, all were swiftly and brutally put down. In 1970 Mobutu held an election in which he was the only candidate and in which voting was mandatory. Not surprisingly, he got 99% of the vote. In 1971 he began a program of cultural awareness and renamed the country the Republic of Zaire. He ordered all Congolese with Christian names to drop them and change to African ones, baptism of children was outlawed and Western-style clothing and ties were banned. The next year he renamed himself Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Nbendu Waza Bunga, although for convenience's sake he allowed others to refer to him as Mobutu Sese Seko. He also fostered a cult of personality in which his picture appeared everywhere, on everything from postage stamps to the country's paper currency. His erratic, corrupt, and authoritarian rule resulted in several coup attempts and secessions. Mobutu's solution was to stage public executions of those who were real, potential, or imagined threats to his regime, but he later found that it was much less trouble and garnered much less bad publicity worldwide if he just bought off his enemies, which he proceeded to do. He also nationalized foreign-owned firms and deported their European owners and managers. He handed the firms over to his family members and political allies, most of whom immediately robbed the companies blind, sold off their assets and kept the money. The resulting economic anarchy caused by these actions forced Mobutu in 1977 to bring the Europeans back. In that same year a force of several thousand rebels followers of the executed Tshombe invaded the province of Katanga from their bases in neighboring Angola. They were well trained, motivated and led mainly by professional mercenaries from South Africa and Europe, and they swiftly and decisively routed Mobutu's ill-equipped, poorly trained, undisciplined and disorganized army. He appealed for aid from France, which airlifted several thousand Moroccan paratroopers who eventually defeated the Cotonou rebels. However, a year later the rebels attacked again, but this time with more troops than before. Mobutu's ragtag army fared no better this time than it did the year before and was decisively defeated again, with many of its soldiers tearing off their uniforms, throwing away their weapons and fleeing naked into the jungles. Katanga, with its vast mineral, diamond, and ore deposits, was on the verge of declaring its independence, and there was nothing Mobutu could do about it. Once more he appealed for international help against the communists. France and Belgium dispatched troops to put down the invasion, with the US supplying logistical and material help, and the invading forces were driven back across the border into Angola. Despite these crises, Mobutu still had time to build up his personal wealth, which by 1984 was estimated to be at least $5 billion. While he amassed a fortune, the country was going broke, and in 1989 it defaulted on loans from Belgium. Mobutu and his family and cronies having looted the country for years almost non-stop, the treasury simply ran out of money. This situation resulted in most roads, bridges, and other elements of its infrastructure beginning to literally fall apart because there was no money to maintain them. Most government workers were paid sporadically if at all, resulting in tremendous inflation and a level of corruption that was mind-boggling even for Africa. The sheer scope of mismanagement, embezzlement, and outright thievery by Mobutu and his cronies resulted in economists coining a new word for his form of government: kleptocracy. The cult of personality fostered by Mobutu and his government was pervasive. Pictures and portraits of Mobutu were everywhere. Government employees had to wear buttons with his photograph on them, and on TV broadcasts he was seen descending from the sky through clouds. He also awarded himself such titles as Lion Warrior, Savior of the Nation and Supreme Combatant. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 did not bode well for Mobutu. He had always been able to count on support by Western governments, no matter how much they disliked his domestic policies. Because of the Congo's huge size, vast mineral wealth and strategic location, he was able to paint himself as a bulwark against the communist menace in Africa, and the fact that his country held vast untapped reserves of gold, silver, diamonds, timber, etc., didn't hurt, either. However, now that the Soviet Union no longer existed, Mobutu's claim to be an anti-communist bastion in the heart of Africa was irrelevant. Under pressure from Western governments and because of economic problems and internal disturbances, Mobutu ended the ban on political parties and brought opposition figures into the government. Despite his attempt to co-opt the opposition by playing different factions against each other, however, the main opposition parties joined in one single organization in 1994, forcing him to appoint one of their members as his prime minister. In addition, Mobutu's health began to deteriorate, and he started to spend more time in Europe for medical treatment. In 1996, Tutsi rebels took advantage of one of his absences by launching a rebellion and taking control of the western half of the country. Other rebellions were launched from eastern Zaire, and in 1997 the combined rebel forces defeated Mobutu's army and took Kinshasa, the capital. Mobutu fled to neighboring Togo and then to Morocco, where he took permanent residence. The seeds of Mobutu's downfall were sown in the Rwandan genocide, when about 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred by about 200,000 Hutu extremists aided by the Rwandan government in 1994. The genocide ended when the Tutsi-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front seized the whole country, leading hundreds of thousands of Hutus, including many of the genocidal killers, to flee into refugee camps in eastern Zaire. Mobutu welcomed the Hutu extremists as personal guests and allowed them to establish military and political bases in the eastern territories, from where they attacked and killed ethnic Tutsis across the border in Rwanda and in Zaire itself, ostensibly to prepare for a renewed offensive back into Rwanda. The new Rwandan government began sending military aid to the Zairean Tutsis in response. The resulting conflict began to destabilize eastern Zaire as a whole. When Mobutu's government issued an order in November 1996 forcing Tutsis to leave Zaire on penalty of death, the ethnic Tutsis in Zaire, known as Banyamulenge, were the focal point of a rebellion. From eastern Zaire, the rebels, aided by foreign government forces under the leadership of President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda and Rwandan Minister of Defense Paul Kagame, launched an offensive to overthrow Mobutu, joining forces with locals opposed to him under Laurent Desire Kabila as they marched west toward Kinshasa. Burundi and Angola also supported the growing rebellion, which mushroomed into the First Congo War. Ailing with cancer, Mobutu was in Switzerland for treatment, and he was unable to coordinate the resistance which crumbled in front of the march. The rebel forces would have completely overrun the country far sooner than it ultimately did if not for the country's decrepit infrastructure. In most areas, no paved roads existed, the only vehicle paths were irregularly used dirt roads. By mid-1997, Kabila's forces resumed their advance, and the remains of Mobutu's army offered almost no resistance. On May 16, 1997, following failed peace talks held in Pointe Noire on board the South African Navy ship SAS Outnikwa with Kabila and President of South Africa Nelson Mandela, who chaired the talks, Mobutu fled into exile. Kabila's forces, known as the Alliance of Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Congo Zaire, AFDL, proclaimed victory the next day. On May 23, 1997, Zaire was renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mobutu went into temporary exile in Togo, until President Nassing B. Ayadima insisted that Mobutu leave the country a few days later. From May 23, 1997, he lived mostly in Rabat, Morocco. He died there on September 7, 1997 from prostate cancer at the age of 66. He is interred in an above-ground mausoleum at Rabat, in the Christian cemetery known as Cimetière Européen. In December 2007, the National Assembly of the Democratic Republic of the Congo recommended returning his remains, and interring them in a mausoleum in the DRC, which has not yet taken place. Mobutu remains interred in Morocco. Mobutu was married twice. He married his first wife, Marie-Antoinette Gbiyatibwe Gogbi Yetine, in 1955. They had 9 children. She died of heart failure on October 22, 1977 in Genolier, Switzerland, at the age of 36. On May 1, 1980, he married his mistress, Bobi Ladawa, on the eve of a visit by Pope John Paul II, thus legitimizing his relationship in the eyes of the Church. Two of his sons from his first marriage died during his lifetime, Jean-Paul Nyewa, d. September 16, 1994, and Kanga, d. 1992. Two more died in the years following his death, Kangula, d. September 24, 1998, and Manda, d. November 27, 2004. His elder son from his second marriage, Anzanga Mobutu Banga, now the head of the family, was a candidate in the 2006 presidential elections and later served in the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo as Minister of State for Agriculture. A daughter, Yakpwe, nicknamed Yaki, was briefly married to a Belgian, Pierre Janssen, who later wrote a book that described Mobutu's lifestyle in vivid detail. Altogether, Mobutu had at least 21 children. With Marie Antoinette, first wife Nyewa, Ngombo, Manda, Kanga, Ngawala, Yango, Yakpwe, Kangula, and Dagbia, 9. With Bobi Ladawa, second wife Nzanga, Jala, Toku, Ndakula, 4. With Kozia Ladawa, mistress and twin sister of his second wife Yalitho, Tent, Sengboni, 3. With Mama 41, Senghor, Dongo, Nzanga, 3. With Mbengwula, a son, 1. With an unknown woman from Brazzaville, Robert, 1. On trips across Zaire he appropriated the droit de cuis sage, right to deflower, as local chiefs offered him virgins. This practice was considered an honor for the Virgin's family. Thank you for watching this video.